Hey guys, it's Steve here from CG Geek with a new exciting Blender tutorial covering the hot topic of simulating and rendering fire and smoke all within Blender. So I've done a lot of testing, a lot of different settings recently with the smoke simulator in Blender and working with materials, and I've come up with what I think is one of the best ways to simulate and to render realistic fire and smoke in Blender. So before we get into it, I'd like to thank NordVPN for sponsoring this video. NordVPN is one of the biggest VPNs available, offering safe, secure, and quick internet access anywhere in the world and available on all your devices. So I was actually looking into VPNs recently myself, and until now I wasn't really impressed by the other options. But NordVPN is super fast, easy to use, and offers completely secure private internet browsing. Plus, if you use the coupon code CGGeek at checkout, you can save 77% off of the 3-year deal. They also offer a 30-day guarantee money back, so there's no reason to not try it right now by signing up with the link in the description. Okay, in Blender right now, I'm using Blender 2.79b, but this should work and be relevant for a while and will work in Blender 2.8 as well. And I'm just going to go ahead and close off our window here, and we're going to start by creating a terrain to burn. Basically, we need something to emit our smoke from, and it's better if it's not just a flat area, but something with some depth and bumps to it. So I found the easiest way to do this is just to enable the landscape add-on. So go to user preferences, we'll just bring this over here, and start searching for the landscape add-on. There we have it. Check that box, and now it's enabled right there. So we can close that off, and we can delete our default cube for now, and as well as that lamp, just delete it. We'll switch to cycles render. Remember to do that, it's important. And after that, we can go ahead and go Shift A, Mesh, Landscape, and add in our landscape. Now it's a little bit too small right off the bat, and so we need to make that bigger. So first, let's pull up our settings here, make it a little bit wider, and we'll start by the mesh X and Y, and we'll make this 16 by 16, which should fill our grid floor right there. Very nice. Now the bumps are a little bit shallow, so I'm going to go ahead and make those bigger by scrolling down here and changing the noise size. First of all, the noise is a little bit small, and then the height of the bump as well. So that's changed down here a little bit further. We have height, and this is going to be about a 2. But you can see it's suddenly flattening off, and that's because we need to change our maximum to be higher than 2. So we'll go up to about 5 with that. And you can see we have some little mountains. Now the noise size might still be a little bit small, so I'm going to make that bigger, probably about a 4. And that's looking very nice. And then you can also change the fall off. Right now it's falling off in the X and the Y. You can choose none, but that can sometimes be a little bit hard to get an angle on where you don't see the bottom side of the mesh. So I like to choose just Y. If I go to Y, you can see we have our mountains, but we have a flat side to them too. So that looks pretty good. I think the noise could be a little bit bigger still. So I'm going to go up to about a 5 with the noise size. And then you can choose a different noise type and get some really cool looking results here. I'm just going to quick scrub through these until I find one that I like. That one looks very cool. But I don't want too much height, because this is burning ground and you want to be able to see the flames. Very nice. So too steep and it won't look so great, but that does look pretty cool. I just don't think it's going to work for this very well, so I'm going to keep going through here, picking a few different options. That one looks pretty cool. If I turn the noise size down a little bit, so we have a little bit more terrain there, that should be perfect. So I'm going with Slick Rock, and I'm using about a noise size of 3.5 to be nice and even. And that should work for our needs just perfectly. You can also change the depth a little bit. So I'm going to go down here, right here, depth, and you can take it down a little bit actually, because I don't want such pointy points in this, pointy points. I'm going to go down about a point, or just a 4. And then the last setting is the resolution. I don't want it to be quite so high, as if I hit Z here, you can see there's quite a few vertices, and for simulating smoke, I want a little less than that. So I'm going to go to the mesh divisions here and take it down to 64 by 64. So we have just some simple terrain, and that will be perfect. We can always add detail later. So with that said and done, I'm just going to hit Tab, and that gets rid of our settings and makes our changes permanent. So if you are happy with your mesh, you can do that now, and you have your terrain set up. Now we need a domain for the smoke. So I'm going to add in a cube. I could have just used the original cube, but it's fun deleting that cube because it deserves to be deleted. And then I'm just going to hit S, scale, and 8. So it scales it right to our domain size. Now it's a little bit bigger than we need. So I'm going to hit Tab to go into edit mode, and then I'm going to scale along the z-axis to make it a bit shorter. I'm going down to about a 0.7. And then I'll move it up just below the bottom there. So we have a little bit extra below, and then quite a bit for smoke to rise up. I might go down just a little bit more, right about there. And hit Tab, and we're good. So we have a domain and our ground, and we're ready to start simulating. So the way I'm going to simulate is there's a few different ways to have the ground emit smoke. You can have particles, you can have adjust the geometry, you can have volume, but what I like to do is I like to use weight paint. So I'm going to switch to weight paint, and this is really cool because you can choose exactly what parts of the mesh you want to emit, and then if you want to get crazy, I'm not going to be doing this in this tutorial, but just so you guys are aware of it, you can actually use modifiers to add more or less vertex weight to your mesh, basically. So you can animate it. So you can have fire trailing across your scene as an object is spreading or something, or you can have, you know, a footprint adding fire to the ground or something like that. So really cool. And that's why I like to use weight paint, because it has a lot of control. But for now, I'm going to change my strength to be about a 0.5, and I'm just going to start drawing around where I want fire to burn on this sort of hillside. So I'm just clicking around and making sure to put a good amount of fire all around, but keeping it kind of random so it's not like fire all in one spot. Make my brush a little bit smaller maybe with F. And you can see the controls that I'm pushing right there with that little add-on I have. And so yeah, just putting some fire pretty evenly across. You want some closer to the camera and some further, so you'll get some nice depth of field later on. But you don't want anything to be pattern looking. You want it to be pretty random. Fire is very random. So I'm going just about so, putting some little patches around where like some grass might be burning or something if you want to get creative. I'm just doing the smoke for this tutorial. But yeah, you can do whatever you want. Maybe attach these patches a little bit. And that's gonna pretty much be all we need. We don't need to get too crazy. Something like that's looking very nice, I think. So a little bit more in all the corners. Make that patch a little bit bigger there, maybe. Maybe make that look a little bit better there. And we're ready to go. Cool. So with that done, I'm going to go object mode. And we're going to go ahead and give this a smoke simulation effect. I'm going to close my toolbar off with T, and I'll hit Z to make things solid. Although I can't see my mesh then, so I'll hit Z again to make it wireframe. And then I'm going to go to my simulation physics here, and I'm going to choose smoke. I'm going to choose flow for the ground, and I want to change the flow type from smoke to fire and smoke. This is very important. If you don't do this, you won't get fire simulating in your scene. So you choose fire and smoke, and that is really all you have to do. I like to change the sampling, give it a few more subframes, as that makes it look nice. And then the last very important thing to do, so don't forget this step, the vertex group. Give it the vertex group that we just created, and that's going to be the flow source, essentially. So that's going to be where the smoke emits from. So with that set up, all I have to do now is select my domain, and if I go smoke domain, you can see that we have a little cube in the corner there. I'm just going to choose smoke adaptive domain, and I'm going to jump to frame 1. And that's another thing. You can change your simulation to be much shorter. I'm just going to go 150 frames. So change that to 150. And if you hit playback right now, we should see our smoke and fire simulating. So a very basic simulation, and of course very low quality, but you can see that it's simulating from all those areas that we painted, and we're getting kind of a nice smoke effect. You know, nothing too fancy, but it's there. And before I change too many settings, I want to put my force fields into the scene, because force fields are going to give you much more realistic simulating smoke, because it's going to add some randomness to the smoke and give you much more control over the smoke. So on the same layer, it's important to keep in mind, go Shift A, add in a force field. This force field, the first one we're going to use is going to be turbulence. Turbulence can really give you that random looking fire effect. Without it, you have really straight looking flames and it just looks completely fake. You need to add some random wind effect to your simulation, and turbulence is the right option for that. So I like to give it a noise value of about 5, and then the strength is going to go all the way up to about 40. I'm going to type 40 in, and suddenly you can see that the smoke starts, well, not yet. I want to change the size. The size is kind of what creates really small turbulence or much bigger turbulence. So I found 5 to be pretty middle of the road. And as soon as I choose that, you're going to see that the smoke starts kind of going back and forth like that. And you get way better realistic simulating smoke. So that looks a lot better. And I might go even a little bit higher with the strength, 45. And you can see you kind of get those flames kind of peeking up there. It's a little hard to see in the low quality, but it's looking pretty good. And maybe a little bit more noise as well. So with that said and done, it looks quite nice. And I can go on to my next force field, which is going to be wind. I'm going to put my cursor over here and go Shift A, add wind. Now with the wind, you want to rotate it so it's kind of coming from the side, maybe from like the west area here. And you can see that kind of blows some of the smoke that way a little bit, but not as much as we want. So I'm going to take the strength and I'm going to crank this up to about a 1. You don't want a crazy amount of smoke, but enough to move it a little bit so you can kind of push it in the direction you want. And then I'm going to give it some noise. So I'm going to give it about a 3 on the noise. And you can already see that some of the flames are kind of moving that way. So if I went very exaggerated, you can see it flies over there. But I really don't want too much. So I'm going to go about a 1.8. We'll just go to an even 2. So we have a little bit of the smoke kind of generally going that direction. And that looks quite a bit better. So we got our simulations in place. Maybe give this a little bit more rotation along the Z so it's not straight side to side. And with that said and done, let's take our domain and really make the simulation pop with some better settings here. So the first thing I'm going to change is the scale. I found that the simulation comes across as too quickly by default, and it looks way better if you can slow it down a little bit and actually kind of see the flames. So I changed this to about a 0.55, maybe a 0.6 will be fine, and it just slows down the time of it a little bit so you can really kind of see the flames. If you're going for like super realistic higher frame rates, you might want to crank that up to a 1. But I found for our simulation of a nice flame, it really helped to slow the scale down a little bit and give a little bit slower time. So that's what I did. I went down to about a 0.6. And then we want the smoke to dissolve after a while. Not too quickly, as we want to sit in the sky for a while, but we want to dissolve eventually. So I'm going to choose dissolve here. And you can see that right away it's like disappearing immediately. I'm going to change the time to be about 40. So it starts to fade away, but it does last for quite a while in the sky. And then the last thing is it's rising way too fast, I think. So to slow this down, I gave it a temperature difference of 0.02. And you can see that just completely slows down the simulation a whole bunch. But then you can come back and give it a little bit more of a rising smoke by changing the density. And I found that going to about a 0.2 was good here. And that just kind of gives you a nice even amount of smoke coming up, but then disappearing at the right time. You could tweak these settings even more if you wanted. Maybe make the density just a little bit slower so it's not quite as quickly raising. But something around that looks pretty good. So about a 0.18 and a 0.02. I'm going to leave the vorticity, the turbulence in the fluid at 2, as I found that looked very good, and changing it didn't really give me better results. And then it's down to the smoke flames. The speed of the smoke is basically adjusting the size of the flame, and I did want to make this a little bit smaller, as I found the fire was a little overpowering to the smoke by default. So I took this down to a 0.9, and I think it looks a bit better just to take the smoke or the fire values down a little bit. Everything else can be remain the same here, so you can just drop that down then once you change that to 0.9. And then it's the smoke high resolution. So this slows down your simulation quite a bit, but adds all the detail you need to have a realistic smoke simulation. Now, I did some testing, and I found 2 to do the best at giving me some nicer looking results. If I jump back to the beginning here, you can see it start to simulate with the high resolution smoke. And it's already putting that like extra fine small flame detail in there. But it's going to slow down as soon as I crank this up to 2. And that is what I found to be the happy spot, where you get the fastest bake times with the best realism. It's about 2 divisions here. And then the resolution, you're going to want to change this for your final res. So I'm going to change this. On my final render that you saw at the beginning was 128. For the tutorial, I'm going to stay a little bit lower, maybe just go like an 84. But before I do that, I'll change that to 84 right now. I'll change this to 2 divisions. And that is what I found to be about the happy spot, like I said, for resolution versus bake time. You could change this up to about 100 or 120, but any further than that, you're kind of wasting your time because the return you get for the amount of time you spend isn't really worth it, I think. So right around there is your happy spot. And you could also go up to a few more divisions in the smoke here if you wanted even more fine detail, but again, not really necessary in my opinion. So this is kind of the happy spot I found. But you want to go down to smoke cache then. And you're going to have to save your project first if you want to be able to bake it. So go ahead and save your tutorial, or in this case, it's not your tutorial, it's my tutorial. You guys can just save it as whatever you want. And then I'm going to change the endpoint to be 150, so it matches our timeline. That's all you have to do there. And so with that set and this set, we are ready to bake our simulation. So I'm going to go to frame 1 and bake. So you click bake, and it'll probably take, for this resolution, maybe about 10 minutes. So I'll let that go, and I'll be right back with you guys when it's finished. And I'm back with it finished here. You can see the finished simulation, and it looks very nice and pretty high quality for a render that, or a bake, I should say, that only took about 5 minutes. So not too bad. One thing, I did realize that my timeline here was hidden in my recording earlier, but it shouldn't be a problem, as the only setting I ever changed down here was changing this to 150. And you guys probably got the idea of what I did, even though it was off camera. Okay, so with this ready though, I think we're ready to render it. But if you want rendered right now, you'd be a little disappointed, as all you would see is a blank cube. So that is where the fun comes in. So first off, before we start rendering, let's just give our terrain here a blank, kind of black, just above black texture. I'm going to give it an almost black, but just a tiny bit of color to it. So we're going to go about a 0.00 or 0.01 is good. And so that will fix that. And now we're ready to render. Before, actually, one more thing I want to do is I realized when I was rendering that the smoke kind of renders on the surface a little bit more than it should, I think, to look realistic. And to kind of fix that air where you see like a little bit of a chunky smoke on top of the ground when you wouldn't have that, I added a simple, to our ground plane, a simple displace modifier. So add a displace modifier, and you can see it moves it up. And that's pretty much exactly what we want to do. I'm just going to change the direction to be along the Z location, and then I'm going to change the mid-level to just be a 0.9. So it just moves it up above the chunks of smoke, basically, and so you only get the pieces that you want kind of showing through. And you can play around with this value if you want a little bit more or a little bit less, but this is what I found to look pretty cool. So I'm going to go about a 0.93, I guess, for now, and I can always change that later. And then you can just turn it off for the viewport. So you click the I to turn off your view, but as long as the camera's still checked, it will render. All right, so with that said and done, let us start our material. So split our window, grab our domain there. Let's split this a little bit more. And we're going to go to our node editor. So with our domain selected, we can hit N to close our properties tab there. And I'm going to go materials, new material. And you can see we have a basic diffuse. We don't need the diffuse. We're going to delete that, and we're going to add in some volume shaders. So first, shader, volume absorption, and shader, volume scattering, right there. So both these are going to be added together with an add shader. So now this shader is a little bit more advanced than your typical shader, but it looks a whole lot better than just using a basic volume and absorption shader plugged into the material output. There's a few tips and techniques that we do to make this look way better than your basic volume, material in cycles. And that's what I'm going to show you guys. So it's a little bit more advanced, but it's definitely worth it. So I'm going to add an add shader here. We're going to plug the volume in the top, the volume absorption in the bottom, and then I'm going to add in an attribute node. So Shift A, input attribute, and I'm going to name this density. Now it's important that you spell it right, otherwise it won't work. So make sure you spell it density. And then the factor is going to go into a multiply node. So I'm going to go ahead and add a vector converter math node, and we'll change it to multiply. This basically allows you to adjust the intensity of the smoke. So you can think of it as adjusting the density, basically, because it multiplies it by itself and makes it more or less intense. So you're going to plug this into the top. And the bottom value, I found a value about 50 to look good, so this is going to be your density value. And then it can go into the density of the volume scatter and the density of the volume absorption node. Now I'm going to duplicate this math node just once so I can control the density of the volume absorption separately, as this should be a little bit less. So I'm going to take this to be about a 0.3, and this basically takes the 50 and cuts it down quite a bit, going down to a 0.3 versus I think 0.5 is the default value. So it takes it down a little bit, so it's not quite as dense for the absorption. Okay, now both these nodes, if I split my window here a little bit, we can start rendering this and seeing what it's looking like if I plug it into the volume shader here. And if we go rendered, you can see we have our smoke rendering. No flames. Let's add some flames. That will brighten things up a little bit. So I'm going to go Shift A and add in a mix shader. I'm going to use this for the flames. And I'm going to add an emission shader. So shader, emission, and the emission is going to go in the bottom with the smoke in the top. Now right now you can see that, oh, that doesn't look too good. And that's because we need to add a factor to tell Blender what is smoke and what is fire. So I'm going to duplicate our attribute node here with Shift D, and this is going to be named flame. And this will control what is fire and what is smoke. Now before we can just use this, whoops, I spelled it wrong. Again, like I said earlier, it is important to spell it correctly, otherwise Blender will not work with the density and the smoke. So we're going to use a little bit of math now to come up with the best solution to use this as a factor. Now you can use some color ramp nodes, but I found that using math gives you more control and allows you to get the best results with the best amount of customizability. Customizability. It's a word. Okay, so to get the factor for the smoke and the emission, we're going to take this plus the density node. So I'm just going to duplicate this to make it easy for us. And I'm going to add in a math node. So converter, math. And we're going to change it to subtract. So we're basically going to subtract the density or the flame from the density. So you do that, you put them both together, and then this is going to be the factor. So right away you can see we get some interesting results. I'm going to put a multiply node in here as well to control the amount. So basically it's good to throw a multiply node in there anyways to kind of give you some control over the values. And I'm going to put this at, I think, about a 2 for now, or maybe a 1.8. Now it's a little hard to tell right off the bat what the right value will be, but I am going to take this down to about a 1.3 just to make it a little bit less and exactly what I had in my video. Plus you can see the smoke is coming out very white, and that is because we need to add some color to it. So I'm going to quick pause on the simulation here. I'll come back to adding color to our fire there, and I'm going to add color to the smoke. So I'm going to go Shift A, Input, RGB. I'm going to create a very dark gray color here, and I'm just going to plug this into the color on the volume scatter and the color on the volume absorption. Now it only does a little bit right now because we still have to work on the smoke a little bit. So let's give the fire, I should say, not the smoke, the fire, let's give it some color. So to control the color, we're going to use a color ramp node. So converter, color ramp. And essentially, this is going to be the factor, the attribute node from the flame. So plug that into the color ramp here. And essentially, you want to think of this as a flame. And this is the darker burned flame, and this is the hot white flame. So this will remain white, but then we want to put in some yellow in here. So I'm just going to control right click, or left click actually, it's the left click. And I'm going to give it some yellow value, make it a little bit more intense. A nice yellow flame, and then right here, I'm going to add some orange. Now this is something that you can definitely play around with a bit, but we're just kind of creating a flame in here. Maybe a little bit more of a red, a little darker red right there then. Okay, it's looking pretty good, and if we connect this to the color of our smoke, you can see that we're starting to get some color into our flame. Still not looking great, and that's because we aren't finished, but you can see that there is some definite improvement in our simulation. So now that we have our flame here, we need to work on what is the strength of the flame to tell Blender what value should be more intense in the flame and what value should be less intense. So to finish up the smoke material, the last thing we're going to do is a little bit of math to give it the right strength value in the emission shader. So we're going to start off with a math node, of course, and this will be multiply. And we'll use this right about here, and then I'll Shift D it, and this time it's going to be greater than. Okay, so we're going to take the factor of this, put it into the bottom of the greater than value, and then this is going to be about a 1 or a 0.18. And this is going to tell Blender that no value greater than 1.8 essentially for the smoke, and it's going to work to give us the right intensity in the flame. So then this will go down to the top of our multiply node, and then we're going to take the original value and put it in the bottom. And it hasn't done anything yet, obviously, because it's not connected. And I'm also going to duplicate it one more time so we can adjust the intensity of this value. So this will go on top, and then this will go into the strength. Right now, you're not really seeing anything, and that's because we need a very intense value. So I'm going to take this up to about 150, and boom, you see we have some intense burning flames, and it looks way better than it did a moment ago. So that is getting there. Not there yet, but getting there. And you can see we get some nice looking, or nicer looking flames burning in our simulation here. A little hard to see, but yeah, there you go. You can see you're getting much better fire. So, to work on finishing up our render, this is the final node if you guys want to screenshot it or something, but not too complicated. And if you followed along, you should be good to go. So now I'm going to go solid, and I'm going to add a little bit of environment lighting. So I'm going to switch to environment lighting right here. I'm going to choose right here, use nodes. You can see our background shows up right there. And then if I choose this button right next to color, I can, right here next to color, I can choose environment texture. So now I'm going to open an HDR real quick, and I'll put a link to this HDR in the description, but it's just a basic HDR. But I want to change the strength down to be pretty small. We'll go about a 0.3. All right. And now I'm going to jump to a different layer real quick so I can see what the HDR rotation is looking like. And let's set up our camera first. So I'm going to find our smoke, and I'm going to kind of pan around it and find an area that I think might make for a cool render. Right about here looks pretty cool, I think. So I'm going to grab my camera, and I'm going to go Control-Alt-0. And that's going to snap it to that view. Now you can see that the camera is basically inside of the flame, and that's just kind of fakey because you never see someone get that close to fire to get a shot of it. So you're going to want to change your camera to be a very zoomed in focal length. I'm going to go about 90. And then I'm going to hit G and my middle mouse wheel to really pull my camera out so I'm not right inside the fire, but somebody kind of shooting a shot of the fire from the outside. So now I'm going to double tap R to kind of rotate my my camera until I don't see the edge of the mesh there. I'll rotate it a little bit on the angle there too, so it is hiding the edge of the mesh there. And that's looking pretty good. But we need to now see what our HDR is looking like. So that's why I set up the camera, because I'm going to go back to a different layer here, and we're going to see what our HDR is looking like in the background. So if we go rendered, you can see we have just some plain trees, which isn't too bad, but if you want to control this real quick, you could add in an input texture coordinate, and this is under the world settings right here, and you could add in a vector mapping node. You take the generated to the vector and the vector to the vector on your texture, and now using the Z rotation here, we can pan it to any spot we want. So I'm going to leave it as something kind of like this area here, where we have, well, right about here, we have some dead grass. It looks kind of good. So we'll leave it at that. If we go back to solid, you can see, or rendered, you can see we still have it in the background. So I'm going to scroll down and choose transparent, so we don't see the background, it's just lighting it. And then I can switch to my flame, and we can see what our fire burning is looking like. And it's looking pretty cool, I think. So we can change a few values though to make our fire look a little bit more intense. Now that we have the lighting set up, so I'm going to grab my flame object there. I'm going to go to our material settings right there at the box, if you see it there. And I'm going to give the flame a little bit more intensity. So by changing the colors here, I'm going to pull the white values out a little bit. We might give it a little bit more intensity, maybe pull these down a little bit so we can get a little bit more white into our intense areas there. It's looking kind of good. And then maybe trying a different interpretation here. Maybe ease will give us a little bit more of the flame value we're looking at. And then what we can do to just kind of punch this up a little bit is duplicate a multiply node and use it in a factor right before it to, again, give it more intensity. Just like I said, this multiply node can kind of work to intensify any value. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to give it about a 0.18. And you can see that just punches the whites up and makes it even a more intense flame. And I think it's looking pretty cool. So I can jump to a further shot here in our simulation. And you can see our flames are looking very nice. So I'll leave this right around here. Maybe give it even a little bit more of an intense flame. And then you can adjust this value to adjust the amount of smoke to flame. So if I go 5, you can see that we have a lot more flame coming up, which is kind of cool. And if I go 0, you can see we have, well, no flame. If we go 1, it's less flame as well. So I'm going to go with a little bit higher of a value than I had, about a 1.8, to bring up a little bit more fire in that smoke and make it look a little bit cooler. Maybe even a 2 would be good. It's going to kind of depend on every simulation a little bit, but you can tweak this to get the right amount of flame in your scene. I think I'll go a little bit higher because I did like a little bit more. So I'm going to go 2.4. And we can see some flames now kind of coming through the smoke back there, and that looks very cool. Maybe 2.5. So 2.5 is what I'll settle for. And then this value, obviously the density of the smoke, and this value, the intensity of the flame. I might take this down just a little bit as the flame is a little bit intense. But that's looking very nice. So before we render, the last thing I want to do is give it some depth of field. So I'm going to grab my camera settings right here, distance, and I'm going to choose limits so I can see what the distance is. And I can close this off now. And I want it to be focused on a flame sort of in the middle, so we have some out of focus fire here and out of focus fire here. So I'm going to change the distance here, and you can see with that little plus sign, that's going to be your focus point. So I'm going to focus that in by sliding the slider all the way to about 25, I think is going to be about right. Maybe a little bit more actually, 29. And that puts me right about where I want in the fire there. Very cool. Now we need to give it a little bit more depth of field. So I'm going to change the aperture type to f-stop, and then I'm going to give it a 0.1 on the f-stop here. So that will be very shallow depth. And then for the bokeh effect, I'm going to give it 5 blades here and a little bit of rotation. And that'll just look good for things that are out of focus, kind of give it a nice blur effect. So if I go render now, we should see our fire, and it's looking very cool. We have that depth of field kind of coming into effect, so we only have some sharp flames and some out of focus flames, and I think it's looking really cool. So now you can kind of work on the composition of your flame a little bit. I might want to rotate my scene this way a little bit more, so the out of focus is a little bit more to the side, and the sharpness, sharp flame is a little bit more dead center. But that's going to about do it. So our final render settings here, I'm going to put denoising on, so we can have some nice cleaner flame without having to go too high of a resolution. And the sampling, I'm going to leave that, we'll leave it 128 for now. I'm going to change it to GPU rendering, as that's going to be faster for me. That's going to depend on your system hardware. And I think we're ready to render. Final thing is changing the interpolation type to filmic. So if I give you guys a quick preview here, this is what it looks like right now with the default device. And if I change this view to filmic, now this will be changed on default actually in Blender 2.8. So if you're using Blender 2.8 already, no worries. But otherwise, change it to filmic, and we'll get just better control over our light values. So with that change to filmic, you can change the look then to be sort of a medium high contrast. So I'm going to go look. Things are slowing down a little bit here with the rendering. So I'm going to go medium high contrast, and that just gives you some nice looking fire effects. I'll switch this back to solid. I'm going to pull my camera out a little bit just so I can have a little bit more in focus, as the depth of field was a little bit strong for me, I thought. And pull it back just a little bit more. Play around with that just a little bit. See what that's looking like. I think that's looking pretty cool. You have some nicer, sharper flames over here and some more blurred flames over there. I'm going to switch back to solid. Just a little bit more rotation and pull the camera that way just a little bit more, and I think the composition will be quite nice. So I'm going to quick give it a render, guys. I'll show you a few compositing effects, and we'll call this good to go. In my final result, I did add a few extra particle effects, as you might have noticed, and those are very simple to do, so I'm not going to cover it in this tutorial as I don't want to get off topic too much, but it's basically done with just some particles emitting up with no gravity and just using some Brownian motion to give some erratic motions, and then giving it a simple material and having them out of focus. But that is for a different tutorial. And so I'm going to give it a quick render, and then I'll give it just a few glows in compositing to show you guys how you can really make it punch, and we'll call it good. So I'll be right back. Alright, and here's our finished render effect. It's looking pretty good. Obviously, for a quick test, it's not too bad at a low resolution. And if I switch to compositing, choose use nodes and backdrop, I can add a few glows real quick to this. So I'm going to go Control Shift, and we'll add in a viewer node. And you can see we still have that transparent background. So I'm going to start by adding a color alpha over, dropping it right in there. We'll put this on the bottom slot. And then we can give this just a dark gray background so it's not in the way. And now I can add a few glows real quick. So I'm going to go Filter, Glare. We'll drop that in right there. We're going to change it to Fog Glow. And if I take the threshold down all the way to a 0.1, you can see that boom, all of a sudden it looks like it's heated up and we get some nice looking effects. Now you can play around with the size of this. I like a bigger size 0.8 about. I think 0.8 is pretty good on default. And you can take the intensity down a little bit by taking the mix value down to about a minus 0.1. And then I'll take the intensity down a bit. And then adding one more glow for more of an intense glow, taking the scale or size all the way down. And you can see the difference between this and this. It just really intensifies the bright areas a little bit. And of course you could do any sort of color grading you want to this, but that's going to do it. We have our finished looking fire, and it's looking very cool. If you animated it, it would look like something that I showed you at the beginning of the tutorial. So that's going to do it, guys. I'll go ahead and play our finished animation that I rendered out earlier right now, so you can see what the kind of results is you can get by doing the simulation and materials. And I hope you guys have had fun following along with this tutorial. If you create something cool, link it in the description, and I'd love to see it. I can pin it then, or heart it, or whatever you do nowadays. And that's going to do it for me, guys. So hit that like button if you liked it, hit that dislike button if you didn't like it, and I will see you guys in a future video. Bye-bye!